DRM is one of the biggest issues facing the modern video game industry for the consumer. Rather than protect them, like it should, it instead protects the profits of the companies that use it and leaves the consumer with a tainted product. In this video essay, we'll start by exploring the history of game storage and how DRM came to be the unfortunate juggernaut that it is today. Then we'll look at the ways in which we should be worried about DRM and how it's harmful, as well as a small exploration of alternative solutions that give the player back ownership. Most people think of arcade cabinets as the first generation of video games and their storage, but before that, there were games made by early computer engineers and programmers for room-sized mainframe computers that were stored on punch cards, like Colossal Cave Adventure. Though things like this existed, home video games weren't really accessible to most people until the first home console, the Magnavox Odyssey. Though the Odyssey came with removable game cards, they didn't actually store the games. When you put them in, they connected pathways inside the machine that told it what to play. It wasn't until Atari's incredibly successful Atari Video Computer System, or the Atari 2600, that ROM cartridges, those big bulky plastic things, were popularized. These had actual software on them that was stored on megabytes of memory, and if they had batteries, they could have information written to them instead of just read, as long as the battery held out. Cartridges were especially popular from 1977 with the release of the Atari 2600 until around 1995 when Sony's first PlayStation brought disc-based storage into vogue. After the PS1, pretty much every home console switched over to discs. They were cheaper and easier to produce because they weren't as proprietary or material heavy, and they didn't have the faulty connection problems that plagued so many cartridges. They also boasted larger storage sizes, though they had slower load times because of the change from solid-state storage to optical, and they were scratchable. The other issue with discs was that they were difficult to write to, so memory cards were introduced, and memory cards held the writable data like your game saves. Though there were computer games before it, mostly stored on floppy disks and cassettes, PC gaming wouldn't really become a popular thing until later, as the technology inside consoles and computers became more and more similar. Now, they run similar hardware in similar configurations, and they aren't as specialized as they once were. You've even seen things like a Nintendo Switch running Android, a completely separate operating system, because they're built on the same technology. This leaves them more open to being exploited like a computer, especially if their storage is similar. It's hard to put a cartridge into a computer, but when the games are all downloaded over a network or stored on a Blu-ray, it suddenly becomes a lot easier to get a hold of those files and to manipulate and redistribute them. Because we live in a world with internet access and file sharing, people can take advantage of unprotected systems and potentially access paid content without permission. In other words, pirating it. With the uptick in popularity of computer gaming in the early 2000s and the advent of the internet, piracy became a risk like it had never been before. People sharing and copying games became as easy as downloading it off the internet. The material cost to produce a pirated copy of something went down to zero and brought the barrier of entry down to piracy to owning a computer. Look at Napster. Anyone could download music without paying for it, and no one minded because sharing it cost them nothing. They still had their music file. Now, almost all games are at least partially downloaded, usually from a storefront like Steam or the PlayStation Store. Thanks to faster internet speeds and cheaper, larger computer storage, it's made it much more convenient to play and buy games. But with that convenience, it's also unfortunately brought significant problems through DRM. DRM, or digital rights management, is the solution that publishers came up with to prevent piracy in a digital age. It usually involves some sort of a middleman between content, books, movies, TV shows, video games, and the end user that validates that they own the product and that they're using a legitimate copy rather than a pirated one. It isn't one single technology, rather a category of software. The idea behind DRM started as a part of a smaller project focused on software packages and libraries, but even as the concept grew and more technologies were implemented, it kept the same fundamental principle: to maximize profits for the seller by imposing restrictions on what the buyer can do with their product. It stops the user from having unrestricted access to the product to ensure that it isn't shared or copied. Advocates of DRM try to argue that its goal is to protect the consumer in the end, but many times it just ends up limiting what the consumer can do, and it almost always makes it impossible for the user to share or resell the content, even if they could with a physical copy. There are a number of forms of DRM for games. Even before everything was downloaded, publishers were including forms of it through things like disk checks, CD key activations, and activation limits. But as the internet became more and more integral to games, things like online activation, which requires an internet connection to install the game, or account verification, and an online check every time the game is opened, even for a game you've already installed to your computer, have become more and more normal. Some games even require players to be online at all times, or they simply won't work. Basically, what all this amounts to is that you don't actually own any of the games that you play. You're buying access to the game while the developer and the publisher continue to allow it and allow you to play it. At any point, they could simply pull support for the game, stop validating the checks to let it run, and stop you from playing it outright. Services like Steam have the ability to pull access to any title in your library because they're the middleman, and you need permission from them to play your games, even though you've already paid for them. There's very little stopping them or any of the game's publishers from simply deciding you can't play your favorite game anymore, and there's often very little you can do about it to get around it. Many people argue this is an unrealistic fear and that games won't get pulled, but take Tron the Evolution, for example. It was a game that Disney was forced to pull from storefronts after it ran into licensing issues. Even if you already owned the game, you were stopped from playing it if you hadn't already installed it because the installation connected to Disney's servers to validate your copy. And while that didn't uninstall the game from users' computers, there was another somewhat chilling example where DRM-protected content was removed from devices. In 2009, Amazon removed copies of George Orwell's 1984 from thousands of Kindles. They discovered that the ebook had been published to their store even though the publisher didn't own the rights to the book. And without a notification and without permission, the book was scrubbed from any device it had been on, because Amazon was no longer validating the checks, even though the readers had already paid for it. I understand pulling the book from the store, but to unceremoniously remove it from customers' hands post-purchase? Come on. If it had been an actual physical book, it would have been nearly impossible and illegal for them to track down the copy in everyone's house, take it, and destroy it. But because it's a digital product, it can be taken away at any point. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not we've just kind of gotten used to DRM. It was extraordinarily controversial when companies were going crazy with it, with things like always online modes and single-player only games that noticeably affected gameplay and smoothness. But now it's become mostly invisible to the end user in a lot of ways, all going on behind the scenes. We've become complacent because it hasn't affected us, and we trade our ownership of the game for the convenience these storefronts give us. But even if the restrictions on the product can't be seen, they're still there. Imagine if Steam decided to pull a game like Half-Life 2 from users' accounts. Even if that never actually happens, should we be comfortable with them having that power and us just being expected to trust that they won't do something like that? I don't think so. There are services out there that do sell games DRM-free. GOG, for example, is one of the biggest, and they do a great job at making sure that users will be confident that they'll keep their libraries. You know your games won't disappear because GOG has given you actual ownership instead of holding them behind a validation check. The problem is there aren't enough platforms like this, and the bigger ones like Steam hold no such guarantee. I'm not saying that developers should allow their works to be pirated, but I think that there has to be a better way to make sure people don't steal games than holding everyone else's ransom.